Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chair Yellen. It's great to see you again. I want to associate myself with the remarks of Senator Scott, but I also want at least some consideration for the underemployment and unemployment of Native American citizens. I think where you will look at those numbers, I will tell you they are even worse in Indian country because of the isolation of the geography and additional education challenges. So I think I always want to point out that we can't leave our Native American citizens behind. I also want to associate the remarks on small community banks, but I don't want to spend all of my time talking about it because it gets eaten up pretty quickly. So mostly what I use these for is to say, what's on the horizon? What are the challenges that we're going to have? We know that retirement security is a huge future burden in this country, but I want to focus on automation and what automation will mean for employment, especially employment in the categories that Senator Scott was talking about. In a 2015 speech, the chief economist of the Bank of England referenced a startling statistic that 47% of all U.S. jobs are likely to be replaced by technology over the next 10 to 15 years, and that would be more than 80 million altogether. Obviously, we see this from automation in trucks. We see this from retail moving to online retail. So I'm curious what steps the Fed has taken to study the issue of automation and the impact on the North Dakota economy and the U.S. economy moving forward. And I know you always say better training, but obviously, a lot of concern on how we implement that and how we move forward. So, automation.
So we know that automation and technological change more generally has had very important effects on our economy over many decades, and we're not seers of the future that know exactly where it's going, but certainly there are dramatic accounts of changes that are on the horizon that could have profound effects on the labor market and on productivity growth.
Do you think we're paying enough attention to this issue? I mean, obviously during the campaign, a lot of talk about trade and the displacement that globalization has played. A lot less talk about automation, which I think has been a larger driver of displacement. So how do we get the public attention to this? How do we get the educators' attention to this? And how do we change the labor market and the skill sets that we need to change so that eventually we end up with employment in our country?
So generally, automation and technological change more broadly has been a source of growth in incomes for America generally, but it's created huge disadvantages for those with less education and often for those in manufacturing and other areas that have seen outsourcing or affected by both automation and globalization. And I think we need to think about ways to address the needs of those workers because they've seen chronic, long-standing downward pressure on their wages and income that are making it very hard for them to cope.
Yeah, I think one thing that gets lost in this is when we talk about those workers, we're really talking about people 40s and 50s. They're less concerned about their livelihood than the opportunity that their children are going to have. And so I think we need to be having a major discussion about what the job of the future looks like, what the job market of the future looks like. I want to get in one more question, and this is about the lack of prosecutions after 2008 and what we can do about it to hold people more accountable. New York Fed President Bill Dudley put forward an interesting idea by requiring firms to adopt a so-called performance bond as a large portion of executive and senior management compensation. Under his proposal, any fines or penalties incurred by the firm would be paid directly by performance bonds, which would incentivize senior leaders to design and implement systemic changes to improve the firm's culture. What's your view on the current incentive-based pays on Wall Street? Do you think firms rely too much on equity-based compensation? And what are the risks with the Dudley model?
So I think that that was an important factor in the financial crisis, in inappropriate incentive schemes. And we've worked in our own supervision to insist that firms put in place compensation schemes that don't lead to inappropriate risk-taking. They may include longer periods of deferral or clawback or forfeiture provisions if an individual who takes risk on behalf of the firm, if there are losses that are suffered. But I think it is important to strengthen incentive compensation practices.
Yeah, one of the concerns that I have, and you know, I'm not a big believer always that enforcement is a strong deterrent, especially if someone's addicted, but I do believe that enforcement is a strong deterrent in white-collar crime. And I think there is way too often this sense that if I didn't know about it, I'm not culpable. And so I think in order to really respond to people's concerns about Wall Street and what's happening, we need to have a better system of not only civil enforcement, but criminal enforcement. And so be looking at this in this Congress and very interested in feedback from the Fed and from other regulatory agencies, because I think without that ability to prosecute, you know, $1 million fine may shock, you know, a factory worker in Cleveland. It's not going to shock a Wall Street banker. And so we need to do a better job holding people accountable.